So Twitter's kind of blowing up over this new article, The Lost Generation by Jacob Savage. Great name, by the way. But it was written and published over at Compact Magazine, which I'd never heard of. But I know it's been blowing up because it apparently proves what everybody has known without the need of numbers or studies, that they've been discriminating at a systematic level by the numbers against white people, men especially, which of course I fall under that category. But I thought it wise because I have not yet actually read it for myself. I was going to read this, not literally, but I was going to read it and give my thoughts kind of on what I see, and we can take it from there. Because if you are just now realizing that white men have been discriminated against in this country, and I predict it's way over a decade, but this study goes back to 2014, where apparently it really got shifted into high gear. But this is why whenever someone asks me for a study, it's like I know they're a normie idiot, a midwit, as we like to call them on the internet, because most people, they're basically frogs in the kettle. They don't understand it's boiling until they're already dead. And I think that the society we've been living in the West, I think they've basically been counting on this for decades, at least 2 generations now. Because white men are generally very nice. I'm very nice myself. It took me a long time, probably till I was about 21, to actually start standing up for myself in person. But as I read through this article, I know for a fact, no matter how egregious it is, because I will get to the numbers eventually, of course, but I know for a fact that no matter how egregious this is, there will be no racial consciousness kind of awoken within white people. And I actually think that the term white itself is demoralizing. If you've ever traveled or met people from Europe, you know that every single country there is very different from the other. When I was a kid, I think, and this is why I think this, I remember thinking of white people as basically a monolith. The first time I met someone from Scotland, I don't really remember where they were from, but they were part of the UK military, and we were training with them, and this guy supposedly spoke English. As a Scotsman, I could not understand a word he was saying. And language is supposed to be the one thing that binds us, as far as, Anglos at least. So this will be interesting because first, this is a part of their playbook where we're all grouped into different groups. But I can't imagine a group more diverse than those put into the white category. So I'm going to get to the article. I'll read them on my own time, and I'll kind of give my thoughts as I go through. And just starting off with the article, it seems like he was a writer trying to get into Hollywood, which I do remember growing up as a kid. I was born in the 90s. The early 2000s and before that were basically the golden era of Hollywood. I remember being able to walk down without knowing what was playing, choose a movie at my local theater based on the artwork of the poster alone, and I had a pretty good chance of it being good. I don't think I ever walked out of a movie like I do now if it's not like up to snuff or quality. But back then it was just different. That's actually how I watched National Treasure, which is one of my favorite movies. But apparently he tried to go in 2016, which was too late for the white man, of course. And apparently he was told, even though they liked his script for his show he wanted, that the writing room was all men, all white men, and that they couldn't have a room of all white men anymore. So despite the fact that they loved his script, he was not allowed to join the team. I mean, how many people have had this kind of interaction and just not even known it? They just say, oh, we've found somebody more qualified. That's of course is corporate speak for go fuck yourself. You do not need these people's words. You just look at how their actions are. All the ads we see, it's blatant propaganda. If you look at ads from the 90s and the early 2000s, completely night and day, pun intended, to what they are now. They don't want white men. If they do want white men, they want ones that'll actually submit, bend the knee, or be trans. That's basically it. Yes, and then later down the article, he's talking about how when Trump came in with his second term and started taking the chainsaw or the axe to the DEI establishment, people were pissed because everybody assumed, and this is everybody who, I would say probably half of millennial men and Gen Z did not believe this at all, but that other half, and then everyone else, Gen Xers and Boomers, they all believed that DEI was some well-meaning kind of justice that was sorely needed to bring the country together. Unless you're an idiot, you knew that wasn't true. And yes, he makes a very good point in the next couple paragraphs that if you were probably 30 years old or older at the time, that the DEI stuff didn't really affect you because you weren't hiring for your own job at the time. You were hiring for the entry-level jobs. And yes, so my generation, and Gen Z especially, we are being radicalized and mocked for it, as if nothing is happening to us at all. And this is coming from a person who, and I attribute this almost completely to my status as a veteran, I've never had issues getting work. But my first kind of exposure to this DEI BS was me working at my Catholic university's gym. And the guy told me explicitly, I was one of the basically supervisors, a shift supervisor, so I would make sure everything was done and the checklist of things we had to do was done. I was in there a little bit later because I was in the military. I was probably 25 to 26 during this time. I was told that despite my actual merit, because I was one of the best supervisors there, I was the only white one. Of course, my boss was a white guy. He didn't say this literally, but he told me that despite my experience, I had to go through the hiring process every year. The only supervisor to do so. I was literally interviewed my second year by the people I was in charge of, 2 of them. It was a board of about 4 people. I'd never heard of that in a business in my entire life. A supervisor being interviewed to maintain his job by the people that he was supervising. After the 3rd year, it was basically after COVID happened, he hired new people and he promoted some other people. And I didn't even interview for the job. He basically told me that after that 3rd year, I wouldn't be hired back. So I got a different job. And mind you, this is 2020 when I think I started to really see this in my own life. But besides that, I've never had difficulty getting or maintaining a job. And like I said, I do attribute that to just being a veteran. But yes, when later down in the article, he talks about how one of the prevailing critiques of media at the time was that it was dominated by white men. And of course that was true. Of course, I don't know how you could deny that. But it seems to me, which it shows in this article, all these critiques, they always start from a gendered kind of perspective. You don't have enough women in your whatever business, whatever field. I mean, damn, I'm seeing this right now in coaching. So in the NFL, people are complaining that there's not a female coach. But of course, with football, it kind of was the reverse where they started racially. But either way, you can see, in actual non-athletic areas, it always seems to start with the women. I know video games are the same way, movies are the same way. I remember Jennifer Lawrence complaining about her co-stars making more than her, even though she wasn't as big of a star. My main question though is, I know for a fact that a lot of these women, they are not into the same stuff that men are. And so I always wondered, how do these places even become AstroTurf in the first place? Like, they have all these mandates for DEI, and I wonder if it's just propaganda or something? Is that why more applicants kind of come out of the woodwork? Or is it more of just we're going to hire an HR person who's a girl to fill this writer position because we need a female perspective? I'm assuming that's the way it happened. And then after that, they kind of created their own pipelines within universities to kind of backfill their trailblaze, AstroTurfed positions. So further down the article, he talks about a guy named Andrew who gets into the media. Looks like it's about 2015. And as he gets in, he thinks he actually has a promising new career. Let's see how that goes for him. Of course, he works his ass off, has side gigs, works nights, sacrifices his life. Literally, his time and his life and his effort and his stress, his cortisol levels. I can't wait to see how he's rewarded. So in 2019, it looks like Andrew becomes an editor-in-chief for New York Magazine. It sounds very prestigious, but of course, the critique to that announcement is that, quote unquote, another white man gets that position. And after he gets in that position, he starts noticing that kind of all the discussion around him starts being shifted towards diversity metrics. See, at this point, if you didn't see this before, this should be massive red flags to literally anybody. Anybody who's in the position of slight, power, as soon as you start hearing about diversity, it will not stop at entry-level jobs. Of course, what these people want is power. They don't just want representation, they want power. They want your job. The article goes on to talk about how if a position that was decently high, that needs to be backfilled, if it was a woman or a minority, that they needed to be backfilled by a woman or a minority. How long down this article till Andrew loses his job? Let's find out. So we're getting to 2020. A little bit later down there, 2020 happens. I know exactly what's coming. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel for Andrew. A white man, editor-in-chief at New York Magazine? Yes, right after the 2020 part of the article, starts talking about how all these magazines, all these journalism outlets started promising to do better. I am not sure if anybody listening to this remembers 2020, but that was literal clown world. I was living around Seattle within a few years. I was in the epicenter of it all. Yeah, so let's go through some of these numbers, these promises, how were they actually kept? Because when politicians make promises, they're empty platitudes a lot of the time. When businesses make promises, they tend to keep them, as long as they're to the correct victim group. So let's see some of these numbers. So it looks like NPR, 78% people of color hired after that. ProPublica with 66% women and 58% people of color. The LA Times and San Diego Union Tribune, they were just 39% male and 31% white. These numbers are insane. As a normie white guy, you would assume, because of all this, all of these media promises, that everything was based on merit. Well, if everything's based on merit, how are the demographics of companies changing within a year that drastically? Did George Floyd's death coincide with something being put in the water of only white men? And let's read this quote from one of the hiring editors. Quote, "For a typical job, we'd get a couple hundred applications, probably at least 80 from white guys," the hiring editor recalled. It was a given that we weren't going to hire the best person. It was jarring how we would talk about excluding white guys. The pipeline hadn't changed much. White men were still nearly half the applicants, but they were now filling closer to 10% of open positions. Yeah, these hirings are later described in the article as quote-unquote emergency hirings. If you don't understand how powerful propaganda is at this point, you obviously don't remember 2020. That should have been the radicalizing red pill of every single white person in the country. And it looks like after this part in the article, Andrew starts becoming desperate, and he does the mortal sin of actually questioning what these hiring practices were for to HR. Come on, dude. He probably does or did make a lot of money, and now he wants to apply to other places because he thinks his is too extreme. Let's see how it works out for Andrew. Yeah, so he applies to several other places, including the New York Times. This guy sounds like a very highly competent journalist and editor. He doesn't even get an interview. And this lack of an interview is specifically at the Atlantic. And the owner, Goldberg, early life alert there, he says a very interesting quote here. He says in an interview, "By opening up the possibilities of younger people, women, and people of color, by imagining their rise in a deliberate way, I've just widened the pool of potential leadership here. There's no quota system here," unquote. Goes on to say, he was candid about another, less comfortable reality. Quote, "It's really, really hard to write a 10,000-word cover story," unquote. He said in that same interview, quote, "There are not a lot of journalists in America who can do it. The journalists in America who do it are almost exclusively white males." And of course, despite him saying that, it says later that 2/3 of their hires were women after that. That interview he gave where he talked about the no quota system, that was given in 2019 before St. George Floyd was killed. And yeah, after that, it talks about how a lot of the leadership were still white men. And if those white guys who were in leadership were hiring other white men, it put a target on their back. Which, yes, that makes complete sense to me. White people are not allowed to be organized in any way and are not allowed to give preferential treatment to themselves, despite every other group doing so. But luckily for some of these guys, they were already kind of grandfathered in. And after this, it starts talking about the low ends of the ladder, which, of course, those low ends become the top eventually. It says later in the article that at one of these institutions, only 7.7% of the new hires were white men. Yeah, and it has quotes from other guys down there talking about where all the guys have gone because all the departments now were basically staffed completely with women. And of course, it now is talking about how as the demographics of the companies change, especially these media companies, the type of stories that were being written also changed. So this is obvious as well, but my assumption during this time was because of the who was in charge, of course, Orange Man, he was in charge during the 2020 riots, at least partially. Yeah, so I always thought that it was more of a kind of refutation of his presidency than anything else, kind of a reaction. But yes, of course, the demographics of your media company will dictate what kind of stories you have because these people have meetings and they decide on what stories to have. And this is actually kind of getting funny because they're starting to talk about some of the stories that they had to tell. So the first one they're talking about is how they were forced to write a story about how calling the cops is white supremacy. And the guy says that always made me feel gross. I think back on that a lot with a lot of regret. I mean, yeah, no crap. So the media was very, very not interesting at all to me. That part was like obvious. I can never cease to be amazed about how idiotic people my age and older are, how naive that all these white people are of their own destruction. It's like they're totally surprised when it comes for them, even though all the warning signs are there. But this one will probably shock me a little bit more, or at least surprise me a little bit. The next portion of this is called the Ivory Tower, Section 2, and it's about the medical DEI. And it looks like it's going to be following a guy named David Austin Welsh. And he posted on Twitter something that nuked his entire career. He says, quote, "I'm 35 years old, I'm a 4+ year post-PhD, and frankly, I'm also a white dude. Combine those factors together, and I'm for all intents and purposes, unemployable as a 20th century American historian." Yes, okay. So I saw postdoc on his little bio. I assumed it was medical, but yeah, he's a humanities PhD. But yes, of course. So he gets mocked on Twitter, and because he tweeted, he dared to step out of line. You know, he probably had to either go to independent or switch careers after getting a PhD. Yeah, big surprise. So this section is about academia. And of course, if you've been in academia at all, and I am in academia currently, I'm going for my master's in aerospace engineering. STEM is absolutely infested with DEI. Because I have an online class, I can't really see the racial demographics, but I see the names. And yeah, it's maybe less than 20% of my class are white guys like me. And I will say this, I had to literally take, it wasn't, a full actual academic class, but I had to take kind of 2 trainings about inclusivity. I'm an aerospace major, and I'm online. And they were forcing me to take these, free classes about DEI and inclusion. I would include them there, but I don't want to dox myself as to which university I'm going to right now. But it's absolutely crazy. And these were like disgusting. It was basically telling me that gender didn't exist and that I was a racist, the usual typical stuff. And again, so in this article, we'll go back to it. It's talking about how academia has had quotas for a long time. Again, how is this legal? My understanding was that you were not allowed to discriminate on race, especially in hiring. These universities, most of them are public universities, I would imagine, they have open gender and racial discrimination in their hiring practices. How is nobody suing them? This is free money. This is the only way to change stuff, is to be suing these people. But either way, this article, of course, going through each department at all these universities, there are more than half the percentage of the people are white males in these universities. I'm noticing a trend here. The noticing part of my brain is flashing hard. If I had a CAT scan, my noticing part of my brain would be frying the CAT scanner. I've been through engineering school and now a master's program at school. I think I've had maybe 2 white male professors out of the dozen plus that I've had. That's my own personal experience. And my undergrad was at a private Catholic school. This is also a little bit wild because I started going back to college around 2017, kind of right in the midst of this stuff, and I was still in during all the George Floyd stuff. I was there, again, a private Catholic school. I was watching people put up banners and doing all this crazy stuff on campus. We had a black student union, of course. Yeah, of course, Catholic school, black student union, make that make sense. But they were going nuts on campus. Now, they weren't destroying stuff. I'll give them credit. They weren't chimping out that much. But they were definitely, they were holding talks and all these struggle sessions on campus. It was wild. And here we go. So academics, of course, they talk about their hiring practices, and it looks like at one of these universities, they started placing a diversity person, a person from the Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity. They reviewed all hiring advertisements, as well as faculty short and long hiring lists. Again, this is basically a DEI commissar overlooking your hiring practices and your propaganda, your posters, and your LinkedIn posts. Again, how is this legal? Well, the answer is, it is legal unless you do this for white people. Yeah, so this is Brown University they're talking about specifically. They hired 40 people after the George Floyd stuff. Only 3 were white. Of course, this is all kind of predictable, but there is a part of the article where it gets very interesting because we all see the demographic collapse. We all see how nobody's having children. This part of the article explains exactly why that is, at least for white people. It's taken a toll on Ethan's personal life. He'd been with his partner for 7 years. They'd spent much of that time treading water financially. They want kids, but without financial security of a tenured position, it is daunting. That decision is on hold and may never happen, he said. Yes, of course, they don't want that to happen. That's one of the effects of not being able to get a job in your field that you spent, 5-10 years cultivating your skills for. Of course, you don't have money, you can't have kids. You don't have insurance, you can't have kids. The next part of the article, they go through kind of media, it looks like TV, Hollywood, I would assume. I'll read through it, and if anything's interesting, I'll bring it up. Of course, the media, Hollywood, they are the front line of DEI. They're the front line of anti-white racism. They're the front line of anti-Western values. None of this that I'm reading is surprising to me. Maybe it will be for you. So the guy that they're interviewing says, quote, "You could read a white guy's script, but there was no way in hell that person was going to get staffed on the show. Showrunners only had a couple of spots for white people, and they kept those for the 40 or 50-year-old white guys they'd known for years. So, if you were a very talented writer who happened to be white, you had no luck. You either had to be a nepotism hire, or maybe you can get in if you were gay." I mean, me personally, I probably would just lie. I mean, that's what I did in my application to my master's. And that wasn't a lie. I'm not 100% white. I just excluded that on my racial, on the racial call out of their application. I just didn't say I was white. And of course, the article keeps going on, talks about talent agencies were now setting out DEI quotas. They didn't want to represent white men, of course. This probably explains why somebody extremely handsome, tall, muscular, and talented like Henry Cavill, he's in barely any movies when he should be like, the next Sean Connery type, the next Brad Pitt type. You wonder why those types of guys, those types of actors aren't in there. And you have weird, strange looking mid women and little twink white boys. That's about as good as you're gonna get. Yeah, to be a non-insane writer in Hollywood who's a white guy, I mean, they describe it as crawling through broken glass. That's basically exactly how it sounds. How hyper competent do you have to be where your script is so good that despite the literal systematic rules you're going against and all the pressure, the media pressure and the brainwashing, like you still manage to get your script on a show? Those dudes must be hyper competent. Yeah, and then this section ends with the guy talking about how he had a fantasy of changing his name and moving to Thailand. I mean, are all these passport bros actually Hollywood writers who are white guys? Yeah, so the next section is basically talking about how these guys who were shut out, even though they were competent, they weren't allowed, which is what we're told all the time. If you fire a bunch of white guys, if they're competent, they'll just go to another industry. Well, if every single industry in the economy is not hiring white guys, especially ones that are recorded to your education, where's the labor supposed to go? There's no trickle-down economics when it's not trickling down, when it's forced to be going down the drain. And here we go to probably the most profound one of all. So it starts talking about medicine. For real this time, I promise. So in 2014, white men were 31% of American medical students. By 2025, they were just 20.5. 11 years and a 15% drop. That's insane. And it says, and I quote, "At every step, there's some form of selection. Medical school admissions, residency programs, chief residence positions, fellowships, each stage tilts away from the white man or white adjacent men. The white guy is now the token." And there it is. So if you have a doctor, I get my healthcare through the VA, and I do have a doctor through my company, but it's mainly for my wife. I don't think I've had a white doctor the entire time I've been at the VA. And I started that care around, I think it was 2017 when I got, 2017, 2018 is when I started actually going to the VA for medical care. And of course it's online. I don't get to be seen in person. But this stuff is basically obvious to anybody who isn't white and who isn't lying. I look at, it was like TikTok and Twitter. I mean, you're seeing entire graduating classes of medical students. They're the ones, a bunch of black women, and they're twerking and like going full ghetto mode at their graduation ceremonies. It's just insane. That's your doctor now, Chud. That's your doctor now. Good luck. And of course, the article now, it's going into kind of the tech sector, the alphabet soup, as I call it. But yeah, Google, Facebook, all of them. I mean, we know, everybody knows. You are either Indian or you're a woman. That's about it. And the numbers here are staggering. 40% drop in that same 2014 to 2024. 10 years, a 40% drop in white men in those companies. And that one I would say is less DEI. That was more of the weapon, but that one's obviously the H-1B visa stuff. The Silicon Valley people, they love H-1B visas. I'm seeing that myself in aerospace. And this is a little bit anecdotal, but we were given kind of our metrics. And I think they kind of let the mask slip a little bit. So obviously in engineering, first pass quality is huge because that's a large kind of valve that can have a lot of inefficiency. My department aims for 90% kind of first pass quality, and they have us divided up by teams. So we have a US team, a Ukraine team, and an India team. And the Ukraine and US teams, they had pretty similar. It was like, I think we were like 90 point something, which is right on the mark. Ukraine, I think, was 88%, and nobody would guess the India one. And I will say, I will preface this, a lot of them are new, but when I was new, I had a first pass quality, I think of around 60 to 70%. We don't give these people hard stuff to do, especially when you're new. They had a combined, I think it was 32% first pass quality. Their team almost rivals us in size. Because for every American that we hire in America, we hire maybe 8 to 10 Indian engineers. I guarantee you this is, of course, anecdotal, but I can almost guarantee this is a perfect representation of what's happening in the rest of Silicon Valley and engineering. And engineering, like medical, that is not something that you can have incompetent people in positions for. Those aren't the spots you can have DEI for. That stuff gets people killed. And it is funny. So it talks about all this labor that was kind of going away. It asks, well, where did all this labor go? And of course, it says, which, if you can see this as well, they go kind of go independent. They go underground. So the 3 big ones are crypto, podcasting, and Substack. So all these writers, finance bros, and kind of subject matter experts, they go into podcasting or writing or into financial crypto. And this makes a lot of sense. That's kind of what I would guess. Not so much the Substack. I'm not really huge with the writing area, but yeah. I mean, you look at any podcast or any crypto bro, they're usually a white dude. And of course, the article brings up, well, what about the great myth of American meritocracy? This is what we were sold. When I was in high school, I was told if I have a good GPA, I can get into college. I would even call myself a bit of a DEI hire. Again, I am a veteran. My grades were never bad, but I kind of always hovered below, like 2 or below a 3.5 in college. That's about where I was in high school too. I've been accepted to every single college I've ever applied to. But again, because my father isn't completely white, I've never put white. I kind of always inherently knew. And my dad would always joke about it too, but I would take him seriously. I would never mark the white category. Even though I look, completely white, a brown hair, white skin, I'm tall. Yes, I'm a white guy. For the most part. So I am a product of this DEI hiring thing, I would imagine. I have not seen in this article yet anything about veterans, which is kind of weird. Veterans seem to be the only kind of victim class you're not allowed to critique, which is kind of BS in my eyes. But of course, now he talks about how it's all okay because other groups in other eras have faced worse discrimination. And in the grand scheme of things, the disenfranchisement of white male millennials was relatively mild. I mean, is it actually mild? I know the article doesn't believe that, but this is the general myth. It's like, oh, boo-hoo, you didn't get the job at McDonald's. I mean, if there is meritocracy, you would get that job at McDonald's. If there was meritocracy, planes wouldn't be exploding, and you'd be able to feed your family. That sounds pretty freaking extreme. Of course, it's not slavery, literally, but it's just crazy that we're okay with this. Like, we're gonna take this lying down because of historical whatever. I thought the point of the United States was that your past, you were judged on your character, not your past or your people's. If my grandfather was Uncle A, funny mustache man, that should not factor into whether or not you're going to hire me. Yeah, so it basically says the entire liberal establishment insists that nothing actually happened, that it was a mild correction, and that, in fact, there was actually no correction at all. All the white men harmed, they were actually mediocre. And yes, of course, I agree with this article when it says, because of what they're saying, is we weren't supposed to notice. And honestly, I think a lot of people still don't notice. It is crazy. Again, I am not personally affected that much by this DEI stuff because I'm kind of a part of it with my protected status. But I'm going to be having children soon. I have one on the way. I don't know their gender yet, but I'm terrified for them either way. I don't want my children and my grandchildren to grow up in a world where their merit doesn't matter, only their skin color does. And it's not because of some Martin Luther King Jr. type morality. It's just that I want an actual meritocracy. And I actually want justice, especially for the last decade of this BS. I mean, longer, if you're going to be actually completely honest. This has not been going on since 2014, 2015. This has been for generations. It's just that now they're actually showing their cards, where before they were being smart and actually hiding it and going slowly. It's not that serious. Yet, without even looking this up, I know that men are the majority of suicides. I was in the military in combat arms. I never lost a friend, personal squad mate to combat. I lost, maybe off the top of my head, I think 6 friends or 8 people that I knew, 6 of them were pretty decent friends, to suicide. If you know someone who committed suicide, I can almost guarantee they're a man. This isn't that serious, and maybe I'm a little bit different, but I grew up my entire life with a sort of brotherhood. I've had only brothers. I was on sports teams that were all men, team sports. I was in the military before they integrated the infantry, all men. I'm extremely sensitive, and I'm extremely sensitive to the plight of men, especially young men, because they did nothing to deserve this type of treatment. And the worst part of it is, if we had been actually conquered through force of arms, I could actually accept that. I think most men could accept that. That's kind of your punishment for losing a war. What war did we lose? It seems to me this was all self-inflicted. And this is the power of propaganda. We literally gave up our arms without even firing a shot. And my generation, millennials, we're way too far gone, to be honest. We don't have nearly the will or the numbers or the consciousness to be able to do anything about it. And it makes sense. You know, if I was still single and I didn't have a child on the way, I'd be very willing to actually do something about it. And that doesn't mean you should be violent, because honestly, you know, we do have the Second Amendment and we have the First Amendment. You cannot use the Second Amendment and be effective in today's world. You have to beat them at their own game. The left can be violent, and the only way men can take back society, especially white men, is through right-wing ideology. You have to use nationalism. You have to use your own version of propaganda, which I will say, Zoomers are probably the best generation at propaganda, because all you have to do is show all this clown world millennial behavior to the public, to your own brothers. That is radicalizing enough. What could be more radical than watching the George Floyd protests? That's what radicalized me. What could be more radicalizing than watching the people you vote for, i.e. the orange man, literally sell you out publicly, and with a smile on his face? And then he asks you to go to war for him. I mean, if I was a Gen Z person, and like I said, I was a military person, I joined my own free will and I fought one of their wars in the Middle East, and I picked up the body parts of white men who were blown to pieces. And I'll never forget one of them. It was his left hand, because he was blown into so many pieces. I had to pick up his hand with his wedding ring still on his finger and put it in a trash bag to send back home to his wife. And what did those people die for? Exactly. This article is just, confirming something that all of us know on the right wing. And honestly, it's starting to matriculate through the public consciousness. Of course, not through the boomers, partially through, I know it's maybe 10, 15, 20% of the millennials. But I actually do have friends. I saw a couple of my army buddies who, they're in the Midwest, chilling with their wives and children. I picked one up from the airport after I got married to do our little bachelor party thing. He brings up out of nowhere, "Hey, what do you think of Israel?" And I was a bit shocked. And I asked him what he thought. And of course, this is kind of where it started with me as well, where I think at the time we had the hurricane and the flooding and the landslides over in West Virginia. And if I remember correctly, those are the people that got the $7,000 loans, and the emergency services were actively preventing people who just, like private citizens with helicopters, from rescuing their neighbors. And while that was happening, they send, however many comical billions, however many comical amount of billions to Israel. So that's kind of what's been radicalizing my generation, I think. Because even me, I grew up with the Israel lie, the Zionist lie. I never thought much about them. I just assumed they're an ally in the Middle East. Makes sense if you don't think about it. But when I went over to the Middle East, I saw all of our NATO allies pretty much. Let me think of who I actually saw. Of course, I saw UK soldiers, British soldiers. We actually went to a dining facility several times because they had the best one, the UK. I saw Romanian, especially the female soldiers, which, if you're a Romanian, goddamn, you got some hot women over there. But they were, of course, walking around, smiling, winking at us. That was pretty awesome to see them. I saw Germans. I believe I saw some French there. But yeah, it was basically every European NATO member, but there was not a single Israeli soldier. If you Google it right now, a single Israeli soldier had not set foot or fired a shot or helped us with the war that we basically started for them. And that's not a conspiracy. We started it for them, and we started it for Big Pharma. And I'm not gonna go down this train, but I will just say, I was there protecting the poppy fields, and I later learned that those poppy fields were being used by American corporations to make their drugs. So I will just say, I'm going to end this by saying this article, it's a pretty decent read. It's a lot of anecdotal, I mean, they do have a lot of data, of course, but it follows a perspective of kind of left of center people who, their response to being systematically shut out of their industry is basically, oh well, they seem upset about it, but they're not really going to do anything about it. I'm not sure what it's going to take. I think it honestly will take Gen Z doing all the work. We've been seeing it around the world. Gen Z has been literally overthrowing and burning down their liberal governments, which is better than what they deserve. But I honestly think the time for collectivization is actually here. It's been past here. I've always thought the strength of Europeans and white people is basically, what's a strength and their weakness, is their individuality. And my theory as to why this has been done from a metaphysical level is they don't want another European or white strongman to come out of the muck and burn it all away. That was kind of the fear, in my eyes, of Donald Trump, because he was kind of a Caesarian figure, at least in 2016. And of course, all of history shows that you can't really overcome the might of Western civilization with actual force of arms, especially the United States. I mean, you cannot cross those oceans and actually take on the United States. But what you can do is subvert and propagandize Westerners into killing themselves, into apathy. And if you need a peer-reviewed study to tell you that, I think you're kind of a midwit idiot. So I'm going to be making this channel. This is my first video, most likely. This will be my way of fighting back. And this is kind of the front lines. The propaganda and the media, this is the front line in this kind of war. I know my generation, we wish it was an actual hot war. I think a civil war, or even a nuclear war, will be less devastating than what it actually is going to be. And I do find it kind of darkly humorous that all these industries in this article, especially Hollywood and the media, the mainstream, the corporate media, these are the ones who are going to be gouged the most by this incoming AI. So these Silicon Valley people who systematically destroyed merit in their companies, they've relied solely on capture of the government and lobbying to secure their positions economically. I mean, where would any of these companies be if they actually had to stand on their own 2 feet? How many data centers would there be without tax dollars? How would any of these Hollywood studios still be open if they created these massive flops and didn't have something like USAID or another NGO to funnel limitless amounts of money towards them to cover for those losses? I will make a different video on this, but the strategy for Gen Z and us millennials who actually want to fight back, first of all, our success and our very existence is mogging these people, and it is infuriating to our enemies. So if you can radicalize or propagandize your own wives and children or girlfriends, that is the way it should be, naturally. Your women should have the same beliefs as you, but find these women and just have children with them. That is the ultimate act of rebellion. The other one is just argue with these people. I'm not saying you should lose your job over it. Don't really do it in person. But if you can frustrate a leftist every day, these people are mentally weak. They will collapse inside themselves like a black hole, like a dying star. Keep in mind, our opponents are not impressive. They rely on people as physically strong as us to protect them from us, which is a whole different thing, because right-wingers, for the most part, white men, European men, our heritage is that our leaders fight on the front lines with us. These quote-unquote elites, these leaders of our country, I don't think a single one of them have actually been on the field fighting, whether in actual combat or on this propaganda front. They have their endless money printer amount of human sacks of flesh They send them out as their shock troops. And when we have leaders like Trump who don't actually represent us, they need to be destroyed. They need to be impeached. But either way, if you do listen to this, especially this far, I am just a rambler. I apologize. I am not scripting this at all. I'll make more videos like this in the future, different topics. But this article tells me basically two things. First of all, it confirms what I've already known, what everyone already knows. And second, it kind of confirms that nothing will be done about it. There isn't a punishment in the world that's harsh enough for the people who actually allowed this and pushed this for this happening. How many of our brothers are actually dead because of this, or miserable, or homeless, or alcoholic, or drug addicts because of this? And I expect nothing less from our enemies, but the fact that this is coming from our own kind especially, I mean, traitors deserve worse than our enemies. I can honestly respect not these enemies, but I can respect my enemy if he faces me fairly. But if my traitor, if I have a traitor, they don't deserve mercy at all. So never relent and keep fighting on, guys. All right, cheers.